Well, hello. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Good. Yes, good. Well, welcome to the next session of of this extremely interesting conference, and thank you very much to everybody for organizing it and for being here. I want to say actually how pleased I was. I've been working on this for like 2 years already, and yesterday to hear Heiko Maas actually referencing articles, an article of mine in The Economist was extremely gratifying, because it means actually that people have begun to take notice of this, and that it's now no longer just a sort of thing of minor interest academically and journalistically. It's great that we're talking about this. I've got the impression that we're a little bit skating around some of the problems. I mean, yes, this is clearly a European problem. We're focusing, obviously for good reason, on the Western Balkans. But I mean, the big question is clearly that this is a problem affecting the whole of Central and Eastern Europe, and it affects Western Europe as well, in the sense that it's a serious problem if the young and the skilled are decanting out of one half of Europe and going to the other half. We've been talking about freedom of movement, and of course that's important, but we have to somehow discuss also at some point this other problem that if freedom of movement means that one half of Europe has freely moved to the other half of Europe, and that's clearly going to have political, economic and social problems. And the other thing that has only just been mentioned just a little bit on the side by Francine Pickup was that this question of depopulation, youth moving, etc. Yes, it's important, but it's actually only 1/3 of the problem. One part is emigration, the second part is low fertility rates, and the third part is the lack of immigration. Well, I don't know if we're going to be able to touch on all of those issues in this panel, but we can at least start. And we've got a very distinguished panel. My first panelist is Mihail Arandarenko, who's professor at the Faculty of Economics at the University of Belgrade. It says, Mihail, in your biography that you've argued that governments in the region tacitly support emigration. That was something that was mentioned earlier on, because obviously it means unemployment figures go down, remittances, etc., and because potentially troublesome people have gone away. But do you think that maybe, and let's leave out the question of COVID for the moment, we'll come back to that, that while that might have been true in the past, that chapter is actually somehow coming to an end, because now a bigger problem for governments are labor shortages. So over to you.
Okay, could you hear me now? Okay.
I can hear you. Yes, go ahead.
Sure. Clearly, the scene is changing throughout the Western Balkans, and labor shortages will perhaps be more pronounced in the decades to come. We have heard about, of course, the demographic prospects for the region, and some countries face a serious depopulation, of course. But I would like to basically present how this model works in its ideal, simplified form, the model that I call the exit and loyalty political economy framework. Of course, in a bow to Albert Hirschman, whose work on exit, voice, and loyalty is one of the classics in social sciences, at least. So, of course, this is a highly stylized, simplified picture that I will offer, but that's the case, of course, with all models. So how that system that I call system of exit and loyalty and little or no voice reproduces itself, I'd like for the slide to be presented now, because I would make use of it. Yes, sorry. Okay, fine. So this is that vicious circle of, next please. Yes, the vicious circle of remittances, inequality, and migration in the Western Balkans. And let's start with something that is considered positive, and that is remittance inflow. All Western Balkan countries actually have remittances of around about 5% of GDP, and some close to 15 and more. So this is this qualifies them as labor exporting countries, definitely. After, could you move to the right side, or keep it simply so that the full slide is seen all the time, please? So when remittances enter the country, they basically increase consumption, and they, because of the composition of the population that migrates, and that's as stocks, at least, that's not only young and educated, that is a very mixed population, and many of them historically and even now have been among the poor deciles of society. So the consumption in the countries that are sending is actually greater than the GDP that is being produced within the country. And also it facilitates the suppression of poverty because poor people often care about themselves by migrating. Another effect that I will not dwell very much is on currency appreciation. That's a sort of Dutch disease effect which enables basically some of the countries to have euro or effective euroization, because there is always enough currency that comes despite the negative trade balances that comes in terms of remittances. But then the adjustment does not stop there. The adjustment also means that the entire tax benefit and public expenditure system can change thanks to the large inflow and stable, in normal times, inflow of remittances. Tax system is based on consumption or indirect taxation, and it enables 3 out of 6 Western Balkan economies to basically have the levels of government revenues and expenditures that are about the European Union average and higher than most of the expenditures that you can see in, for example, Central and Eastern Europe. And that despite the large informal economy and despite the fact that the employment rates, that the labor markets are actually quite weak. So what this also enables is the possibility to for the government to create a large public sector which is well paid and which in a way buys maximum loyalty among the population for the government through employment in the public sector or through other channels. What does it mean? It means that the private sector becomes less important and becomes crowded out in a way, so there is less space for genuine entrepreneurship and work, and there is also rent seeking in public sector. So young people queue to get a job in the public sector because that pays better and the chances of prospects through that political channels are better. This, of course, stalls economic growth, and the countries do not really catch up with the rest of Europe, although they function as basically as a stabilocracies, as some political scientists say. And then this also means that the labor markets reproduce itself. Now we have demographic trends which contribute to the depopulation, which contribute to the reduction in unemployment. But actually, employment does not really increase, and especially good jobs do not increase. So, for example, throughout the region, the wage differentials compared to the Central or Western Europe remain the same. They do not close because of let's say, the improvements in labor market statistics. And then it means that there are that there is still more young people and other people who rely on migration as a means to improve their lives. And I would say, just because I don't have much time, that, well, if I think this is one possible understanding of what's going on in the region. I wouldn't say that this is extremely unstable, but one message that I would like basically to convey is that if you look at the remittance migration nexus in this way, one can say the remittances are not as usually looked at the bright side of migration, and that migration is the good side, but rather that the overall picture is quite blurred and mixed, and that migration for some important parts of the population are actually is the way of social advancement of improvement of their position, while remittances through this government channel have a negative impact. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's it's great that you managed to sort of demonstrate this sort of ambiguous point of remittances. There's something I forgot to say at the beginning, which is that obviously would love some questions, but please don't use the chat function. Use the Q&A instead to send your question. Okay, so now we're moving to Anita Richter, your senior policy analyst and project leader of Southeast Europe Regional Program at the OECD in Paris. I know it's still too early to say, but nevertheless, what are your feelings about how COVID will have affected migration and fertility patterns? How will things look when we emerge from the pandemic? I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but you do work for the OECD, so you know, you're as well placed to guess as anybody else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I do not have a crystal ball. Neither anybody else from my colleagues at the OECD do have such a crystal ball. And I wish I would have it to fully give you an answer to this question. I think it is still way too early to make any sound predictions on how things will move along the way. But nevertheless, I mean, the OECD, we like to look at evidence and to see what are the trends and to predict sort of the future. Certainly what we've seen very recently, also with the migration outlook that has been published by the OECD, it's a more of a global focus, but we can clearly see that already in the 2000s, migration flows have dramatically dropped throughout this year. So compared to pre-COVID period in 2019, with the second wave that we are talking about, certainly with new lockdowns, etc., these negative migration trends will continue, including very likely also for the Western Balkans. How long this will take, when things will turn around, it's difficult to predict. But nevertheless, we all are of the assumption that this will come to an end at some point. And then we have to see how the economic landscape will look like globally, so including the Western Balkans. Because the key question, and what we've been discussing all the time, the major migration push factor are the jobs. So it really will depend on how the global jobs landscape will look like in 1 year or 2 years or whenever from now. And what we already see in the year 2000, clearly GDP has been dropping. GDP has been dropping massively in the Balkans. We've seen up to projected trends up to -12% in Montenegro. For Serbia is getting a bit better with only -3%. But this is automatically affecting also the unemployment rates. That traditionally have been much higher as compared to OECD countries and OECD Europe countries. You know the figures are between 12-20% unemployment rates, which are more than double compared to the OECD. And we already see in 2020 that they are increasing as compared to 2019. On average, they're about 2% higher already, projected to be 2% higher in the Western Balkans. So, and the same figures, the same trends we see for the youth unemployment, which is even more pronounced, which is even much higher in a massive problem. And it's mostly the youth that is going abroad. So having said this, the trend is likely to continue once the flows of movement of people is more easily guaranteed again. It is certainly to expect that the economic impact of the COVID crisis will be even more severe than in the OECD countries, leaving a less unfavorable economic job landscape in the Balkans. meaning that it's quite likely that there will be a new wave of migration flows towards OECD, particularly also European countries, will continue later on. Another thing, besides COVID, one important aspect that I think we should also have in mind is that in parallel to COVID, which is right now overshadowing the fourth industrial revolution that we are in. I mean, it's still ongoing, especially it's even accelerating in a sense that moving more to automation, accelerating the digital transformation. And this, in the future, I mean, there are also some predictions that it will massively change the way we work, the types of jobs that will be globally, in the Balkans including. I mean, everything is interconnected. And so the questions that we heard about is digital nomads. So the way we work, the way where jobs will be, will totally change. So we've seen in the Balkans in the past 10 years, there's been a lot of attraction on the automotive machinery sectors. So with the higher dependence on the European markets, Europe as a trade partner, also these type of investments can change. These type of jobs might change, which will not only might release more people from the job market, looking then for other jobs elsewhere, and also redefining the type of work they're doing in the future. So these are really unprecedented times that will may bring things completely upside down anywhere, including in the Balkans, that have quickly to react to, on the one hand side, on the migration flows, outflows, if the governments are eager to keep people, because skills is the one and key to actually develop your economies, and to adjust with the new economic landscape, societal landscape that we'll have in a few years to come.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for keeping that precise. I mean, it is obviously quite an alarming picture, and I mean, I've got some data here which I'll quote, which is which kind of like reinforces what you're saying, but it's about remittances actually. The latest data from Bulgaria, the data from the central bank, is that remittances have decreased by 65% in 2020 so far. And they are so far, according to the central bank in Bulgaria, 291.2 million euro compared to 836 million for the same period last year. So, you know, it's pretty dramatic, and it also kind of begs the question of, are the people in the diaspora already losing their jobs? So maybe even though you're talking about sort of more people going to OECD countries, actually maybe there won't be jobs to go to in OECD countries. Well, but that remains to be seen. Okay. One other point is that I said earlier, please don't ask questions in the chat function, but in the Q&A function. But I'm reminded that you can also raise your hand, so there's a possibility that you can ask it for real. Now we're going to Edo Omić, your director at the Directorate for European Cooperation and Strategy at the Council of Europe Development Bank in Paris. And the question I had for you is, well, you're working on human capital development in the region. If people with skills from lorry drivers to surgeons emigrate from Western Balkan countries or Balkan countries, Southeastern European countries in general to Western European countries, that in the end represents a wealth transfer, doesn't it? From a poorer part of Europe to a richer part. Perhaps you could talk about some of the ideas that are out there to balance freedom of movement with equity and sustainability.
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Tim, and to the organizers for inviting us to this conference. It's a really great opportunity. Also great to see a former colleague of mine, Anita, here from the OECD. So I knew the conversation was going to be at a high level. No, we couldn't agree with you more. This is an area that we have been following very closely about the wealth transfer from Western Balkans to the Western European countries. We would go even one step further and say that actually the economic dividends that these migrant workers generate in Western European countries come from years of investment in the education and healthcare sectors in the Western Balkans. But instead of being the economic dividends being realized in the Western Balkans, they're being realized in Western Europe. So in effect, the Western European countries are fronting the bill, if you will, to develop part of the human capital that is being utilized in Western European countries. And the question you bring about is how do we create more sustainable and equitable transfer of that wealth transfer? And historically speaking, when we look at what's happening in the region, it typically comes in two forms. One is remittances, which has been discussed already, and the other is EU grant transfers and subsidies. Remittances, when we look at it from our standpoint as well, the real issue that we see here is that in half the countries, the trend has been negative in half the Western Balkan countries, or it's stagnated or leveled off in the other half. And for us, that points to a potential picture of, look, this might not be sustainable in the long term. Might not be guaranteed that remittances will stay here forever. And we also agree with what Mihail is saying. There are a lot of negative economic effects potentially with a high remittances as a percentage of GDP, and that can be real appreciation of the exchange rate to even pushing up the reservation wage within a country. But then the second area that we have seen that transfers happening is through the EU grants and so forth. Conceivably, one could argue that a migrant from the Western Balkans who is in Germany or in France is paying tax, which goes into a budget at the national level, which then feeds into the EU budget, which then comes in the form of IPA financing and so forth that comes back into the EU or in the Western Balkan region. Now, from our perspective as a development bank, what we've seen is that most of that transfer of funds have been coming into hard infrastructure. And as a result, governments and politicians in the region have been essentially incentivized to put their money in invest in projects that are in things such as roads or in energy markets and so forth. Now, that's extraordinarily important. And there's a need for EU grants and guarantees for such projects because this is important for the economic development of the region. But ultimately, that transfer can be more sustainable and more inclusive in the future if it's more devoted to the social sector. And here we think that historically speaking, very little has been devoted to things like education, healthcare, to help politicians incentivize them to invest in these more long-term projects. And we are encouraged. The latest investment plan for the Western Balkans, published about a month ago, does talk about this desire to push more into this area, having an innovative agenda and so forth. And so we think of it as a sense of that money to be utilized to invest in the education, healthcare sectors, and even to some degree housing and affordable housing. If we take education as an example, as one area where we think those transfers could really help, we agree that a certain group of people will always be leaving the region. So why not try to educate the largest pool of people that we possibly can in the region? Yes, some will leave, but then those who stay behind can help progress the economic models that are there and help transition to a more knowledge-based economies. As Anita was rightly putting, there is a huge revolution occurring right now. And by our estimates, 60% of people who are employed currently in the Western Balkans are employed in sectors that are high risk of automation in the next 15, 20 years. So the solution obviously there is to invest more in better educational systems. But when we look at the underlying figures, what we see is a relatively mixed bag and somewhat of a negative picture. There has been, in our opinion, and through our analysis as well, a severe underinvestment in the education sector. And as a result, you will see that a large majority of schools in the Western Balkans will report that they have either a lack of materials, and this is things like books and computers, or a lack of qualified teachers. And they're some of the largest deficiencies in the whole of Europe. And as a result, this is potentially contributing to the fact that students in the region are scoring amongst the lowest PISA scores by the OECD's work in the whole of Europe. So if you want to develop a higher skilled workforce that's going to help transition towards the more human capital oriented future economy, you need a better education system and better investment. Another area that we see there's some deficiency is early childhood education. Here, it's a mixed bag. Some countries are not providing as much formal early childhood education. And for our opinion, and again, from the academic research and that's out there, what we know is that the more you invest in early childhood education, the more you give kids the opportunities and the tools and the skills to be able to better utilize those skills for later educational outcomes and then generate better outcomes later on in life. And it can also diminish the educational inequalities that tend to exist between the rich and the poor. There's also a second benefit that's really quite great about having more early childhood education as well in the region, is that women will be able to potentially enter more into the labor force. Women in the region predominantly take on a large proportion of the domestic care responsibilities, including childcare, of course. So when you have more early childhood education, it can potentially shift some women into the labor force. And let's be honest, one of the problems that we have in the region as well is that female participation in the labor market is one of the lowest in Europe as well. And then finally, we go to this area of vocational educational training. Again, when we look at the region, what we see is that there's a low amount of investment and uptake of vocational education. And this is also correlated highly with a high level of underutilization or skills mismatch as well. And typically when we look at a whole plethora of countries with more vocational education and opportunities tend to have lower issues of skills mismatch. In the Balkans, it's really in the opposite direction. So here we think, again, further investment in vocational education could be a huge step to upskill existing labor, but also give young people who are coming out of the education system the potential to learn additional skills that the actual business market requires. So this is just one area where we think some of that EU transfers could really help mobilize funds to create a better human capital situation that can create more inclusive economic growth. And we also look at other things, but I want to stop there because I'm probably running out of time.
But before we go on to Andrea, I just want to ask you something. That figure, could you just clarify that? Am I right? Because that you said 60% of jobs in Western Balkan countries today are basically at threat from automation and modernization. And did I understand that correctly? And if so, how does that compare with Western European countries? That 60% figure?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it's the current 60% of the current people employed are employed in sectors that might be at risk of high mobilization. Now, it could be that not all of those sectors, all those jobs will be lost, but it's just that there's a higher risk in those sectors. When we compare to Europe, I don't have the figures in front of me, but it is considerably lower, of course. For instance, if you take Germany, only about 1.8% of the people in Germany are employed in the agricultural sector. Now, in the Western Balkan countries, that number can range from 30 to 50% of people are employed formally and informally in the agricultural sector. So that's just one area that is potentially just to show how vast the differences are.
Great. Well, I suspect that in a couple of years we'll probably no longer be talking about depopulation and demography, but this will be the subject, especially when it comes to Western Balkans. Thank you for highlighting that. We're now moving on to Andrea Mchanovich, your youth representative of Montenegro in the governing board of RYCO. And you are in Podgorica, so over to you. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to ask you a question. I'm sorry, that's why you're looking a bit stunned. And I'm supposed to ask you a question. And what I was going to ask you was the way things had been going, at least until the beginning of the pandemic, was that Western Balkan countries were trapped in a catch-22, i.e. needing young and educated people in order to develop and converge with EU economies. But until they're developed and richer, many young people won't stick around to help countries get to that point. I mean, this was something that was talked about a little bit about earlier in the conference, but you know, what are your thoughts on this? Are you going to stick around in Montenegro to make it a rich and developed country, or are you thinking, I don't think I can wait my whole life to do that? Okay, so over to you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your question. And first of all, it's a great honor to be here today and to share my thoughts on such an important topic, especially since I myself am a young person, and I cannot say that I do not have dilemmas of whether to stay in Montenegro and keep bearing the burden of being a young person and therefore someone the society relies on, or to leave and to join so many young people from Montenegro and other countries from the region that have already left and lost their faith. Coming to your question, for example, yesterday I held a workshop with around 20 high school students from Montenegro. And the aim of the workshop was to target the main challenges young people in Montenegro are facing and also to define potential solutions. And everything was fine until the end when we were doing the checkout, and the participants were expected to say how they felt it, during the workshop and what the conclusions from their sides were. And there was a girl who said, and I really quote now, she said, "I feel really happy that I have met so many open-minded people today who are engaged and are willing to contribute to the society and to development of Montenegro. But at the same time, I'm also even more happy that in the next 5 years, majority of us will be living all across Europe or the world, but not in Montenegro." She made a joke and the others started to nod and to laugh, but I wish you could see their faces when they realized that, okay, it was a joke, but it's also the reality. Yes, I would say that young people in the Western Balkans are in a catch-22 because it seems to me that we are constantly balancing between our responsibility towards the society on one side and on the other between our need and our right to seek better somewhere else. And I have to admit that yesterday after the workshop, I felt a bit empty, because I obviously somehow failed in inspiring those young people to stay and to create and also then work on implementing a better vision for our society, because they plan to live in the next five years maximum. So I invested my time, I invested my energy, experience, my optimism and enthusiasm yesterday, but then I'm not sure whether it will pay off and be profitable for the society in the long run. And if we move from that individual contribution of, for example, me working with young people to a national level of, for example, Montenegro investing a considerable amount of money every day into every young citizen, then into every young citizen who will most probably eventually leave the country, then I think that Montenegro's investment in that sense is not profitable, which is one of the, in my opinion, but still at the end of the day, I'm not the expert in the field, but I'm just a young person. But however, I feel that it's one of the most negative effects of youth immigrations from the Western Balkans to developed countries. So it seems to me that we can, for example, talk about Western Balkans region as a, let's say, human capital export company. So on a daily basis, we are exporting young people to developed countries, and we are doing it for free. So our investment in those people who are leaving isn't profitable in the long run. So yes, I think that youth migrations is an issue that should be targeted by the governments of the Western Balkan region. But then what I think is the first step towards it is changing the way government officials and decision makers are perceiving young people. Because I feel that we are usually perceived as those who belong to young generation whose time will come tomorrow, rather than a valuable resource that really needs to be nurtured today. And I think that once we are seen as a, not as a problem, but as a part of the solution, I think that only then we have made the first step towards solving not only the issue of youth migrations, but also all the other issues that target young people. So I would stop here for this first intervention of mine, but I really hope that during the panel, I will have also a chance to talk about possible solutions for the problem of youth migrations, of course, from my perspective. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So now we're going to move to a session of questions. I mean, I've got two, which I'll read out, but if anybody else has questions, that you should put them in the Q&A function or just raise your hand, click the hand symbol. We've got one from Irena Serovich, who says, in terms of future readiness of labor markets in the Balkans, particularly in light of the crisis, but also the digital revolution, where would you suggest policymakers focus their attention? And then there's another question. I think this is directed at Mihail. It says, maybe this circle from remittances to new migration also depends on the level of liquidity problems in the country of origin. Where there's a real liquidity problem, the impact of remittances could be slightly better. What do you think? Mihail, do you want to answer that one, because that's specifically to you? And then maybe other people would like to come up to answer Irena Serovich's question on the future readiness of labor markets.
Yes, that's one of the paradoxes of remittances. When you need them the most, you get them the least. And that happened in the past economic crisis. The countries in the region in 2008 to 2012 had a decrease in remittances because simply people could not come in large numbers to the destination countries of Western Europe. And then as the situation in Western Europe and increasingly in Central Europe improved, because now there is actually larger increase in circular migrants to Central Europe than to Western Europe, where only Germany still accepts labor migrants in larger numbers. So then there was that phase in which the economies of the region grew, but then they increasingly faced the shortages of workers who would, in construction, for example, or in health services and in care services, who would go to Western Europe in good times. Now we have very bad times due to COVID, and then at the same time there is a sudden stop in remittance inflow in the region. So they are basically, remittances are pro-cyclical and they're not good stabilizers as such. So that's basically another problem with them, because they're, we always forget that there are two sides to the migration problem. One is the readiness of people from sending countries, from labor exporting countries, and another is readiness of destination countries to accept them. And of course, now that readiness or the demand for labor is shrinking everywhere.
Okay, thank you very much. So who'd like to pick up the Irena Serovich's question, which I'll just remind you, in terms of future readiness of labor markets in the Balkans, and particularly in the light of the crisis, but also the digital revolution, where would you suggest policymakers focus their attention? But I don't know who wants to pick that up first. Anita, why don't you start with that one?
Sure. Well, looking at the labor markets, I mean, what we've seen is there is already a huge, well, the labor markets are hugely challenged in general in the Balkans. Looking at the high unemployment rates, which will increase in our point of view also in the future with the crisis. In terms of the labor, the kind of skills that is produced, I mean, already as Edo mentioned, the level of skills, the human capital that is produced through the educational system currently will not respond to the changing job landscape in the future. You've seen them through the PISA test and et cetera, that in fact, actually the educational outcomes are rather have been decreasing over the past few years. So there needs to be a lot of attention in order to increase the the quality of education, first of all, in the Western Balkans. The secondly is, yes, to have a better match of the skills and the labor market needs. Already, this is one of the biggest problems that the Western Balkans are facing. The educated people do not have the right skills that are needed on the labor market. The types of investors that are interested to come to the Balkans, they cannot find the right skills anymore. So there's and this is, I'm not telling anything new. The skills mismatch has been a long-standing recurrent issue for so many years. And we have not seen so much the government be very flexible and adjusting to that problem very much. Secondly, now talking about digital revolution, also looking at the digital infrastructure, the skills, digital skills, also companies using digital means, e-commerce, etc., etc. It's way below OECD averages, way below EU averages. So there's a massive gap along all these lines, which Balkans have to quickly actually catch up and to prepare just a reasonable basis to take part in this new area that we will having. One last point, I mean, what we'll also see is, that connects pretty much to the previous discussions, is the type of skills that are have been educated. And this is what probably young people will be looking at is, or when they make their decision on their educational specializations, you know, going to the health sector. But again, if they decide to become a nurse or a doctor, etc., it's oftentimes also because they're attracted to go then abroad with their skills and don't use them where they're most needed in the Western Balkans. Similarly, even if there will be a huge effort to increase digital skills of people and move more into more technological innovation in these kind of things. We see a bit of this trend in Serbia, but not so much for the other countries. Then again, will these skills be used in the Balkans, or will people rather tend to apply those elsewhere because there are better job opportunities, etc.?
Thank you very much. Sorry, I was just a bit thrown because you froze in the last second. Before we go on to some more questions, I'm sorry, to some more answers there. I want to ask you whether, in terms of education and preparing for automation, et cetera, there's a significant difference between the Western Balkans, specifically the Western Balkan 6, and I know this is not an expression used very often, the Eastern Balkans, but basically, I mean, the EU countries of Bulgaria and Romania. I mean, are they basically in the same place, or are they in a significantly different place when it comes to these issues? Because obviously migration has been, and demographic challenges have been equally severe in those countries, if not worse.
I don't have concrete data to compare the Balkans with the other three countries, that Southeastern European countries that are already part of the EU. But nevertheless, what is clear, they are, when we talk about Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, they are also below EU averages across all the lines in terms of digitalization. And still there's a higher migration flow from those countries because, again, it's movement of people is more easily for those countries. The jobs are that are opportunities elsewhere are more attractive, salaries are more attractive, social securities, etc., etc. So even as you're part of the EU, the pull factor to integrate, migrate to another European country, OECD country, pretty much remains the same, and even gives more open doors to do so. Of course, then when you again compare the Balkans to those three countries, I mean, in South Europe, it's also Greece, of course, to look further. They're still at the lower rate. There's still a huge gap between, and it's actually widening gap between the Western Balkans and, let's say, let's call them rather the Central, Eastern European countries that have joined the EU later on. So the gap is widening across all the lines, and in terms of wages, in terms of inequalities, in terms of digital outcomes. So in the first steps, the Balkans need to undertake a huge effort to first close the gap with the other Southeast European, Eastern European countries from the EU, and then the EU levels are, of course, even, I wouldn't say light years away, but this is how it will feel. And sorry to give such a bit grim outlook, but there's a long way to go.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I'm not going to ask the other two about this, because actually there are specific questions to you from Friedrich Puttmann. There's a question specifically for you, Edo. To what extent does the COE, presumably COE Bank, consider? Actually, it just says this dilemma. And could it be that this is overlooked? I'm sorry, now I'm suddenly realizing that I'm not quite sure which dilemma he is referring to, because it says at the top, it says, thank you, Andrea, for pointing out this crucial dilemma. Well, let's go to Andrea. It says a question for you. It says, what, if anything, would you recommend to mitigate the unintended consequences of fostering emigration rather than local development through better education? Since it was you who brought up the dilemma, why don't you start? And then we'll go to Edo.
So first of all, thanks for the question. And there are a lot of solutions I would suggest, but I will now just list some of them, which I think are the most urgent ones. First of all, I think that lack of data is one of the first challenges that needs to be tackled in order to solve the issue of youth migrations. Because I mean, I can speak for Montenegro, but it seems to me that I can also speak for other countries in the Western Balkans region. There are no official and relevant data on how many young people have left, when they left, why did they left, under which circumstances would they come back, etc. And only if we have a relevant data can we define quality and productive strategy towards approaching this issue. Secondly, what I think is important and can be a useful tool towards really encouraging young people to stay in their countries is strengthening youth activism in the Western Balkan region. Because once you show a young person that he or she is important for the society, once you show me that I can participate in decision-making processes, but not pro forma, but rather to really participate and to directly be able to create policies, I will also build a stronger connection than with my society. So in the long run, the level of youth migrations will decrease. And when I speak about strengthening youth activism here, I really want to stress out that our governments should take into account more young people with fewer opportunities. And here I really refer to young people from rural areas, young people with disabilities, Roma youth, etc. Because I'm not sure, as someone working with young people, how much they are into the focus of governments, not only when it comes to strengthening the youth activism, but also when it comes to solving other youth issues. I also have to come back to education, because I think that education is really a tool towards raising awareness of a young person who can then more easily solve dilemmas such as this one, whether to leave or to stay. In which terms, coming back to what I was talking about at the beginning, I really think that the prevention of youth migration isn't only about economic integration, but that it really needs to be about regional, educational, and also scientific cooperation. In a way that, for example, universities across Western Balkan region could, let's say, especially the state ones, offer joint study programs at the bachelor or master level, or we could think of something like Erasmus Plus, but within the region, so that young people can go from one to another country of the region for a semester or even a year, or to think about more cooperation between the universities when it comes to science and technology researches, etc. And also coming back to the last question that we were just shortly that we were talking about previously, how to more connect and prepare young people for the labor market. As someone who's directly involved in the process of education, as someone who's, let's say, consumer of education process in Montenegro, I think that it is of utmost importance that we gain more practical knowledge within the education system. For example, I spent a semester as an Erasmus Plus exchange student in Ljubljana, so at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, and that was the first time I was, I would say, confronted with the case law. It was the first time I held judgment from the European Court for Human Rights in my hands. Okay, I gained theoretical knowledge in Montenegro, but then what about the practical one? So I think that also that can and should be targeted by those decision makers in the field of education. So yes, and what I would like to refer, but maybe later, is the negative narrative that is being served to young people that really needs to be tackled in order to help young people and help me feel more welcomed in my region.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Edo, I don't know if you want to pick that up.
Yeah, I mean, I can briefly kind of try to tackle a few of the questions that just emerged in the last half an hour or so, but I completely agree with everything that's been said thus far. We need further investment in more targeted educational capacity because the region is lagging behind. I think an earlier question you had was, how does Western Balkans compare to other countries that entered the EU after 2000 or in case of Croatia 7 years ago? We'll take one figure, for instance. I believe it was Romania. I have to check because we're going to be releasing a report, by the way, in about a few weeks in our initial findings in the Western Balkan Investment Framework, where we're actually analyzing what are some of the social sector components that are affecting brain drain in the region. And one of the things that we saw with labor productivity is that these countries are just not catching up. They're really lagging behind. If you look at Romania, for instance, in 2000, Romania's labor productivity as a percentage of European labor productivity was about 30%. Today, it's 70%. Part of that is the fact that they've entered the EU, they've gotten a lot of transfers, there's now more investment in higher productivity sectors as well. But in the Balkans, none are even near 60%. Most are below 50%. And in the case of North Macedonia, Montenegro, for instance, labor productivity has actually shrunk. Now, part of that is labor shedding. There's about a bunch of people leaving. But what worries us from our economic analysis here is that there's also a inequality component within the way education systems function in the region. Simply put, if you are from the most advantaged background possible in the region, on average, again, I'm going to refer to the OECD here, the OECD PISA score for someone in the highest income groups in the Balkans is equivalent of the average score of someone who is in the bottom 25% in Europe. So even if you're the best conditions, you're still not going to be able to achieve high returns because of the education system. Now, for the bottom 25% in society, that situation is just dismal. It's horrible. They are receiving the lowest outcomes in the region. So really, there also needs to be a focus on this inequality component within the education system as well.
Great. Well, that's pretty scary. Well, I've got two questions which really pick up on things that both of you have been saying. So I'm going to they're kind of different, but I'm going to read them both. The first one is from Vlora Rečica. She says, "Hi everyone. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Democracy, IDSCS, although she doesn't actually tell us where. I'm sorry, and have just returned from my master's studies in the UK a little more than a month ago. the number one question since I've returned is why I returned. And if I couldn't find a way to stay in the UK. This shows that despite good economic standing, there are deeper issues that push us to leave our countries, including here, corruption, air pollution, quality of life, social values, political culture, etc. And these issues are much harder to address than economic ones. My question is, how do we address immigration due to these reasons, which seem much more complicated and essential? I mean, we've talked about that in general terms already, and I think the whole conference has talked about that in general terms. But I mean, one thing that I would take from that is this question of that somebody raised earlier of, I don't know whether the right word is stigma, but people automatically assuming that that everything is great if you're abroad. Andrea, I can see you shaking your head, so maybe that's something that you could talk about. To a question from Remus Gabriel Angel, who's in Cluj in Romania, and Romania's one biggest expert on this question of immigration and demography. And perhaps this is something that, Edo, maybe you'd like to pick up, or Anita or Mihail. He goes, on the policy agenda, while the topics discussed generally address important topics targeting most of the people living in the Western Balkans, I'd like to learn more on what discussants think about the people in rural areas. What would be the future between migrating temporarily or stay, and the same for remittances and EU funds for these people. So first question is really about this psychological question, this stigma of like, you come back, you want to live at home, you want to work at home, and you want to contribute to your country, and then people think that you've failed. And this, I have to say, is something universal. This is not specific to the Western Balkans. I mean, 2 years ago, I went to Niger on the edge of the Sahara, and I met African migrants who were trying to get through Niger to Libya to Europe. And a lot of people said, and that, part of the problem was that I said, you could end in Libya, you end up in a slave camp, and then you kind of could die in the Mediterranean. And people said, once you've left, it's very difficult to go back because people think that you're just a failure. So, it's a universal question. I mean, sure, there are degrees, but it's not just a Balkan issue. But I don't know whether, Andrea, since you're the young person on the panel, whether you'd like to address that first, and then somebody else can pick up Remus Gabriel Angel's question about rural areas.
So yes, I really agree that there are a lot deeper issues that tend to force us to leave our countries, such as corruption, nepotism, lack of political culture, etc. Those are really huge issues, which we can see also through reports of the European Commission, for example, the one released recently regarding Montenegro. So I am not sure whether I would suggest an extremely new solution or something like that. But what I think is important is to strengthen non-formal education of young people, because through the formal system of education, I have never heard about corruption. I have never heard how to fight corruption in the society. I have never heard about nepotism or what political culture is, which political skills I should gain as a young person, so that once I go voting, I really know what my decision is based upon. I think that in that sense, non-formal education of young people is important, because if you have a socially aware young person, then you can, but who's at the end of the day decided to stay in the country, then you can also, I think, fight even those issues such as corruption, nepotism, lack of political culture, and everything that you mentioned in the question. Coming back to the negative narrative that I mentioned previously, I also think that a huge problem of our societies is the negative narrative that is being served to young people on a daily basis. For example, when I finished the high school, and it was really hard for me to choose what to study, but then it was even harder for me to choose where to study. because it was hard to resist the pressure of the society, of my family members, of my professors, of my friends, who were keeping telling me, okay, you have to leave. This country is not for you. The biggest success of a young person in Montenegro is to leave the country. I decided to stay, and I cannot say that that right now I do not have dilemmas of, as I said in the beginning, whether to leave or not. But up until now, I did not regret for my decision, because I met so many successful people, even in Montenegro, who succeeded without using any form of nepotism or corruption. But you know what's the problem from my perspective? That we rarely read about those young people in the media. We rarely hear about their stories from the people we communicate with on a daily basis. So the really negative image of our society is created thanks to not only media, but also to all of us who are, as you, Tim, said previously, assuming that somewhere else is and has to be better than it is here. So what I think is that we need to hear more about positive examples, because, for example, my example or the example of someone that I know will inspire a third person to stand against the corruption or to stand against some other social problems that are really forcing us to leave the country.
Right. Can I stop you there, because actually we've got like loads of questions now beginning to pour in. So I'm going to stop you there. Like, who would like to pick up on the question of rural areas that was brought up by Remus Gabriel Angel?
I can step in very quickly just to
go ahead.
I mean, here, one of the things that we've seen in our analysis is that there is going to be this migration trend internally as well within these countries. And often we're seeing larger population centers now, urban centers also having larger and larger migration flows coming in there, putting further pressures on the already existing social services. Now, we're all about the social, obviously, at the Council of Europe. And here we think it's a real concern as well, because you see it transformed in one particular element, which is affordable housing, for instance. More and more people are going into the urban centers. This is putting up increased pressure on housing prices. And as a result, people are having a hard time actually be able to afford even the basic shelter components necessary for life. It's becoming very difficult. So there is an area that also need to understand is a huge concern. And then, of course, by having more people in the city centers, you need to invest, again, more in the necessary social services to be able to ensure not only education, but also healthcare. Healthcare is something that is not invested as appropriately as it should be in the region. It's underinvested as well. And poor people who are coming from rural areas into urban areas where they don't have the same incomes, or they have not maybe gotten the jobs yet to obtain a higher level income, will face challenges like higher out-of-pocket expenses in hospitals. This will also create huge problems on their ability to maintain themselves in the labor force in the long term. We've actually seen in our analysis that because of relatively low health outcomes, people drop out of the labor force earlier in some of the countries in the region. And as a result, you're looking at annually, based on our estimates, 275,000 years lost because of pretty much people are prematurely dying or exiting the labor markets.
I mean, let me be a bit provocative here. I mean, we saw the kind of tear-jerking video at the beginning and the old people left behind in the villages and all that, but in the big picture, does it really matter? I mean, surely Western Balkans, kind of Balkan countries urbanizing and people leaving rural areas is a continuation of a natural phenomenon which has been going on for like 100 years, and was just simply much more developed in the western part of Europe, and it's just sort of a natural phenomenon. And sad though it may be, does it really matter in the long run? Does somebody want to pick that up? Mihail or Anita, maybe? And if not, I'm fine. I'm just making a comment, but I can go happily read on the next questions. Mihail, does it matter?
Just to provide a little bit more optimistic picture about the sort of the future of rural Balkans, because coming from Serbia and also having a sort of looked at the other regions of former Yugoslavia, I would say that actually the emigration has had historically a bit of an emancipatory role because throughout, because the first wave of migrants was from Yugoslavia, that was mostly unskilled migrants working in manual jobs in Germany during 60s and 70s. So we have a lot of, let's say, experience with what has happened with the rural regions in Serbia. And it is not great, but yes, there is a depopulation and the internal migration to Belgrade. It is really difficult to sort of point out that that emigration wave, especially those from 60s, have contributed to sort of the devastation of rural areas. I would say that the picture is more nuanced, and that actually Serbia and former Yugoslavia at that time could not handle anymore the sort of rural population that it intentionally left behind. That was the sort of the first 2.5 decades of socialism in Serbia were the decades where people moved to urban centers, and the villages were supposed to, just industrialize or die. And this did not happen, and the immigration actually helped them survive at a sort of at a much smaller base. And that's the metaphor or the way I look at the current depopulation wave, even throughout the Western Balkans. Yes, we face severe depopulation, some countries more than others. For example, Serbia has managed pretty well so far. But in any case, there will be at certain point, now that the sort of remittances and migration have that stabilizing role that is not helpful for development, but still there will be a certain point in the future where this trend would simply slow down and then possibly revert. And of course, there is a lot of action that needs to be done, but one has to be very cautious in projecting, in taking for granted, for example, what we have heard, that there will be a 30% or 40% decrease in the population in 30 years. It does not go like that. And that's also the experience that I can basically draw regarding the rural areas in Serbia. And as I say, yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm sort of conscious that time is actually beginning to run out, just when we're beginning to kind of really take off and get to the meat of the matter. So what I'm going to do now is, although we could talk about the rural question much longer, I'm going to accelerate a bit, and I'm going to read you some of the other questions which have come in. And then we don't have that much time, so I don't expect you to pick up on all of them, but at least we'll know what people are thinking. G. Steinacker says, it's a matter of fact that the state is the biggest employer in all Western Balkan countries, as we've already said. What could the EU do so that Western Balkan countries take over more responsibility and accountability in this field? What's the reason for the failure of governments so far? Well, that's probably a whole panel in itself. Julian Prischka says, remittances decrease dramatically after 14 to 15 years that an immigrant leaves the country. Is there an estimation around the Balkans? Where are the Balkans at this moment concerning remittances? I don't know if anybody, Eda, you're shaking your head, so that one you can answer that one. Elizabeth Herberger says, Andrea, dear Andrea Mchanovich, you say it has to be solutions that the older population does not understand, but you describe the consequences, but the core causes are deeper. Question, inequality, no social justice, unfair behavior on all levels, up to corruption. What do you suggest? And Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous Attendee says, what about digital jobs coming to the Western Balkans? There are many digital workers from the region doing tasks for international online labor markets through platforms. Certainly the case in Serbia, where USA and Canada are getting every year the best part of the high qualified people from Albania. Does the EU have a specific politics to improve the possibility of these people, at least not to leave the EU? Okay. And Falanza Podrimia, who I suspect is from Kosovo, but doesn't say, says, oh, yes, she does. She says, Andrea Mchanovich, you rightfully said that we need to show young people that they can have influence in policy making and decision making. Here in Kosovo, no one wants those young people to know about their real power. Young people either try to leave or be part of the system. Any ideas on how we can educate them through the Western Balkans on their rights, duties, and possibilities? Well, that's it. So let us start. Andrea, why don't we start with you, because there was a couple for you there, and then we will go to everybody else. And then I think we're going to be coming to an end because we've got another 15 minutes left. So Andrea, over to you. And I remind you that last question was from Falanza Podrimia from Kosovo. How should we educate people talking about influence in policy making? And the other question for you specifically was inequality, no social justice, unfair behavior on all levels, up to corruption. What do you suggest? So quite brief, but over to you.
So that second question, I think, relates to what I was talking about previously. So I will just repeat that my opinion is that non-formal education of young people needs to be fostered so that we have socially aware young citizens who are willing to stand up and stand against something that is not in order. When it comes to the question of Falanza coming from Kosovo, it's a hard question, but I would encourage all young people from the Western Balkans who stayed in their countries to first of all be an example to their peers, to share their experience on a daily basis, and to not be discouraged if small steps are made during the day. For example, coming back to the workshop that I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention during this panel, maybe a girl who said that she will live in the next 5 years is not the one who I succeeded to influence yesterday. But there are also some other young people who approached me after the workshop and asked me how they can get more involved into in the organization that I was representing yesterday. So small steps can, in the long run, I guess, lead to really huge impact. And I think that, first of all, we young people need to be aware of the strength that we have, so that then we can expect government officials and those decision makers to realize the same thing.
Great. Okay, thank you. I'm coming now to Anita. I don't know if you noted down a question that you wanted to pick up. If you didn't, I can remind you of one.
Actually, I was looking at this, the question about the digital jobs coming to the Western Balkans from the anonymous attendee. If there's I think there could actually be a good opportunity with digital jobs in the Western Balkans, in a sense that if we are looking ahead and, let's say, big companies further outsource digital jobs, and so you don't need actually to be physically on the ground within the company, so you can actually do your job from wherever, from the Balkans, and looking at the rise or the race for low wages. So if the same job, if it's an accountant job or any other job, office job, can be done from outside the country, from outside Europe, from somebody from the Western Balkans, and having in mind the fairly comparatively lower wages paying there, there's a good opportunity that this may increase, and those kind of jobs that are currently executed in the EU could be outsourced to these digital jobs in the Western Balkans. But having said this, at the same time, there's a competition because we're talking about at the global level, because other people from North Africa or Asia or whoever will also compete for the exact same jobs that might be, these digital jobs that might be outsourced elsewhere. So in any case, what needs to be maintained is keeping up with the future needs, labor market needs, not only looking what is needed in the Western Balkans or Europe, but having even a more global look at the types of jobs that will be available to educate the Balkan people to make them fit to be competitive in that regard. But nevertheless, I mean, it's not only about education. One big aspect we have not talked about, but it needs to be stressed and stressed all over again. It's education, human capital is a major factor, but at the same time, there are so many structural challenges that governments still need to tackle. It's about, you talked about them as well. It's about the social security systems, health systems, also environmental standards, in terms of for the well-being of people. If it's also for businesses, I mean, we talked about this as well. We talked about that people tend to prefer going into the public sector because the salaries are better, the jobs are secured, but there's untapped potential for entrepreneurship. And I think still the business environment, the investment climate is not favorable enough to encourage also young people. I mean, this is where economy and economic development is thriving, from startups, young people, new ideas, that innovations that brought up, and still although there are efforts in place, but the business environment is still rather discouraging young people than to go and start business and drive, and with this enable economic development.
I mean, do you think that you can foresee? Is it possible to foresee in the next few years? I mean, now that we're all working from home. I mean, if you've been working for the last few years in Germany or Austria or Sweden for a good company, and you're now working at home, is it not logical to then think, well, actually, if they want me to work at home for the next year, I might as well go and, why would I be paying for a Swedish rent or a German rent when I could be earning the same amount of salary and go back to Belgrade or Trebinje or Sarajevo or Niksic and earn a vast amount of money for, I mean, not vast amount of money, vast amount of money comparative to a smaller, much smaller outgoings. I mean, is that something that we might see, people coming back to who are already working for big Western European companies?
Yeah, I mean, right now we are kind of forced to do that. Many companies are forced to do that, and people went back home to do the work from their home offices, from their country of origin, working for the international. So the trend is a bit there. The question is how long it will maintain, because we already see the productivity levels are decreasing in the longer run. So I'm not sure if that will be a really sustainable model in the future. Okay. Right now it's forced. Maybe there will be some kind of hybrid format that will encourage teleworking even more. On the other side, the question is, where is your tax base? And yes, if your tax base is still with a Swedish or German company, then it's a huge loss for the Western Balkan government. On the other side, of course, through consumption, etc., if you live temporarily back in the Balkans, you contribute as well in different means, but it's
okay. It's great. Not the same. Well, fine. Okay, fine. So now I'm going to go to Mihail. Specifically, that question seems to be tailored for you. Remittances decreased dramatically after 14 to 15 years of an immigrant leaving the country, presumably because they're having children and having to spend money on their children, not on sending it back to their brothers and sisters and parents. Is there any estimation around the Balkans, where the Balkans is at this moment concerning remittances?
The Balkans is actually one of the highest receiving regions in the world. The average, the ratio of remittances to GDP is close to 10%. In Bosnia, Albania, it is more than that. In Serbia, Montenegro, slightly less than that. In Kosovo, 15% and so. But I would like to say that remittances are actually much more complex concept than, you know, a part of saving from your current wage that you send back home. It is more than that, and in that sense, they are stable, actually, and they can be stable even without, you know, counting only that part that is related to what we usually consider remittances, and that is money that we send back home while we are elsewhere. No, it could be money that we bring home with us because we worked for a brief while, and this circular migration very much increases. As I said, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Czechia, even Poland are new destinations for that short-term work when people just get back what they made with them home. Then pensions are another stable part of something that is remittance in a sense. And then finally, what also gets counted as remittances is actually residual of anything that the national banks cannot count as, you know, cannot ascribe to, I don't know, tourism or something else. So actually the income of digital workers who do not get out of the country is also a remittance in the statistics of national banks. And this increases. So when you look at that, pensions are stable. The income of digital workers, perhaps now due to COVID, might not be really as stable or as increasing and elsewhere. So they're also a stable factor. What is not stable is actually what people bring with them and what they send. This is pro-cyclical. But overall, in the longer term, I do not see remittances decreasing because of a sort of maturity of our stocks. Actually, our stock of migrants in Western Europe is strongly decreasing, and our flows are increasing. And stock and flow in Central Europe is increasing. So it's the picture is much more complex than we usually, you know, if we only reduce remittances to what people send, or to what migrants send to us.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, I've got a question, but I'm not going to ask it because we are running out of time, and I think I'm going to this round go to Edo now because this is your you're next. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Tim. I mean, I know we're pressed for time, so maybe I'll just focus on one component of it, which is that we know what the main push and pull factors are in the region. And I just want us to take a moment to imagine if you were a migrant who left the region and are now living in Germany or France or wherever. The likelihood that you're going to want to come back to a region, unless we deal with some of those structural problems that we're talking about, is going to be very low. There is, yes, huge amount of corruption, huge amount of nepotism. But then you look at other things. And again, I go back to the education healthcare components. If you have a family abroad now, why would you want to come back to an education system that is underperforming to where you are living now? Same with the health sector. Why would you want to now, as an older person, want to live in a place where the health sector is not as strong as it was? Andrea, for instance, she's an inspiration. She's stayed in the region, and there are increasingly more people who are doing so. First, you need to make sure that all the people who stay behind, as I said to my earlier point, need to be as well educated as possible. We have some digitalization examples happening, and there are some digital hubs that are popping up here and there in Bosnia and Serbia, but they're a very low segment of economic activity at the moment. So you need to make sure the rest of the people are also still given the opportunities and skills to have economic opportunities. But like for people like Andrea, as she ages, she's young now, but in the near future, she will need a stable healthcare system that will make sure that she's able to not only continue being a productivity, labor enhancing individual in the long term, just so she can, as a human, stay healthy. Quite frankly, the healthcare systems currently are not sufficiently doing that. And as a result, that actually has a real negative impact on the economic opportunities in the future, because people's productivity is hurt. As a result, their economic output is hurt, which means that economic convergence is continuing to be slowed down, which again creates the economic conditions which will further push people out as well. So there is a circular component to it. Is if we don't invest in these social components, we fear that it could potentially exacerbate some of the situations that are there.
Thank you very much, and that's perfect timing. I'm afraid we have to come to an end this panel. I would like to say thank you very much to all of my panelists, and thank you very much to attendees and everybody who helped to organize this, especially Victoria Palm, who organized this particular panel. It's just fantastic that we're debating all of this, and it's really clear that there are more questions than answers. But I think that probably in the next couple of years, we won't be debating like this anymore, in the sense that we've now realized the scale of the problem. And I imagine that in the next few years that we'll be divided to talking in much greater detail about education, about automation, about rural areas, and so on and so forth. But it's great, especially that the German presidency of the EU has recognized this as a problem, and recognizing that there's a problem. I think this is what psychiatrists say is the first step to dealing with it. So let's deal with it. Thank you very much, and we can now have some virtual food at the virtual lunch break. And to remind you, at 2 o'clock, at least German time, spotlights on migration experiences, and at 3 o'clock, domestic reforms towards a better match of skills and labour market. So from London, thank you very much, and goodbye to all of you.